Mason Caldwell didn't look at me when he ended my career in under 3 minutes. One shrug, one fake professional sentence, and everything I'd built for 4 brutal years was erased. My late nights, my weekends, my entire department running on the systems I created. He acted like I was disposable, like my work belonged to him, like I should quietly disappear so he could feel powerful. But what Mason never bothered to check was the one detail that would turn his smug little world upside down. If you've ever been underestimated, subscribe and tell me in the comments what you would have done. Mason Caldwell didn't even pretend to care when he told me my position was being strategically dissolved. He sat across the conference table with his sleeves rolled up like he'd just finished something heroic, flicking through paperwork he clearly hadn't read. I watched him breathe, steady, calm, annoyingly confident, while 4 years of my work, my nights, my weekends, my entire contribution to Caldwell Financial Systems slipped out of his mouth like it meant nothing. He kept saying words like efficiency and restructuring, corporate phrases meant to sanitize the bullying underneath. I asked about my bonuses, 3 years' worth written cleanly into my contract, and he waved his hand as if swatting at a fly. Legacy compensation, he said. The new financial team is reviewing everything. You'll get the standard severance. That was when I felt the humiliation rise. Not loud, not explosive, but cold and steady, running under my skin like an electric current I couldn't shake. I'd sat right in this room during the security breach 2 years earlier, when Richard Caldwell himself had thanked me for saving the company millions by rebuilding the transfer routing system in a single weekend. Now his son couldn't even make eye contact while he erased me. The silence in that room pressed on my chest, heavy and suffocating. The conference table smelled like cedar polish and burnt coffee, and the overhead lights flickered faintly, as if even the building was tired of Mason's voice. He kept shifting in his chair, adjusting his expensive watch, pretending he was doing something noble. He didn't know the work. He didn't know the systems. He didn't even know the department he'd been put in charge of. He just knew how to fire the person who built the backbone of the company because it made him feel like a real executive. When he finally stood to signal the meeting was over, he gave me that fake friendly smile people use when they're trying to pretend they're not being cruel. "We appreciate your contribution," he said, like he was reading a script someone had shoved in his hand. I shook his hand anyway because sometimes dignity is the only thing you can still control. My fingers were steady, but inside I felt that sharp, humiliating twist you get when someone decides your worth for you. Mason dismissed me, not because I failed, but because he believed inherited authority outranks earned expertise. That's the part that stung, not the firing, the arrogance. As I walked out of the glass-walled room, my badge felt heavier around my neck. HR avoided my eyes as they handed me an exit packet. People in the hallway went silent when I passed, the uncomfortable kind of quiet that happens when everyone senses something wrong but doesn't know how to help. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even let myself breathe too deeply. I just walked to my car, buckled my seatbelt, and sat there listening to my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. Because underneath the humiliation, beneath the anger, beneath the cold shock spreading outward like frost, a single thought formed, slow, sharp, undeniable. Mason Caldwell had no idea what he'd just triggered. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though it was the same route I'd taken every day for 4 years. The Denver skyline blurred through my windshield while my mind replayed every word Mason had thrown at me. Not the corporate jargon, those washed off like rain, but the way he had spoken as if the history of the company began the day he received his title. At every stoplight, my fingers tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I wasn't crying, I wasn't shaking, I wasn't breaking down. What I felt was something steadier, something colder, a clarity sliding into place like a piece of glass, settling perfectly into a frame. 43 minutes after leaving the office, I parked in front of my building. My apartment still smelled faintly of the dinner I hadn't finished the night before. The leftovers from a meal I'd abandoned to fix a malfunctioning transfer queue Mason had probably taken credit for. I dropped my keys on the counter, made a fresh cup of coffee, and sat at my small dining table while the sun dipped behind the buildings outside. The humiliation from the morning had faded into a sharper question. What exactly had Mason fired? He hadn't fired a role. He hadn't fired a project manager or a systems architect. He'd fired the architect of the entire back-end infrastructure, something he had never even attempted to understand. That thought alone should have made me furious, but instead, it unlocked something I hadn't considered in years: my consulting agreement. The original one, the one I'd signed before Richard Caldwell convinced me to join full-time. I stood, walked to the cabinet where I kept old project files, and pulled out the backup drive I always used for my personal work. Everything important in my professional life lived on that drive: drafts, frameworks, early versions of systems, documentation, and most importantly, contracts. I plugged it in, opened the folder, and scrolled until I found it. Contract Initial Consult JM PDF, I clicked. The document opened with the familiar logo, the one Caldwell Financial Systems had used before their branding overhaul. My eyes went straight to the section I remembered, the one I had insisted on because back then I didn't trust companies to understand boundaries. Section 5, Clause B, the consultant retains all ownership and intellectual property rights to any systems, frameworks, or methodologies developed independently or based on pre-existing consultant-owned materials. Client is granted a non-exclusive license contingent upon annual licensing fees as outlined in Appendix C. Appendix C annual licensing fee, $60,000 due each February 1st. My coffee cooled in my hands as the realization snapped into focus. I had received only one licensing payment, the first year. Then the company was restructured, accounting changed, new legal counsel came in, and somewhere in that chaos, the licensing fee had disappeared. I had flagged it twice in email, asked accounting whether the transition affected my original terms, and each time I received the same vague response: "We're reviewing legacy agreements," but they never reviewed anything. They simply stopped paying, and I had never signed a new agreement transferring my IP, meaning for the past 30 months, the company had been using every system, every workflow, every optimization layer that I originally designed under a license they were no longer paying for. Meaning they were out of compliance, meaning everything I built still belonged to me. I opened my development archives next. One by one, I scrolled through logs, timestamps, recorded notes. Everything was documented. Dates when I refined the reconciliation sequence, notes showing which components were built on my earlier frameworks, clear evidence of independent development. Not a single piece suggested ownership had changed hands. Mason had fired me thinking he was removing a problem, but all he'd done was remove the one person who understood what they'd been silently violating for more than 2 years. My humiliation cooled into something far more powerful: preparation. I began gathering every file, every version, every email, every record that proved exactly what was mine. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to burn the company down, but because now, finally, I understood the truth Mason had never bothered to check. He didn't fire an employee. He fired the owner of the systems his entire business relied on. By the time the clock hit midnight, I had gathered everything: contracts, archived drafts, annotated notes, the original frameworks I'd built long before Caldwell Financial Systems existed in its current form. My dining table looked like a makeshift war room, papers spread in careful rows, my laptop open to file directories I hadn't touched in years. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, and in that quiet, the truth sat fully formed in front of me. I didn't just have a case. I had leverage, the kind that didn't require threats or theatrics, the kind rooted in simple, boring, unshakable facts. But having something powerful is not the same as knowing what to do with it, so at 12:17 a.m., I sent everything to the only person I trusted to interpret this mess: Dana Brooke. I'd met Dana at a conference 3 years earlier, during a panel about contract protection in post-acquisition environments. While most attendees treated it like background noise before the networking hour, I'd actually taken notes, fascinated by how clearly she explained the legal traps developers fall into. We'd kept in casual touch, the kind of professional acquaintance you forget about until suddenly you need them. At 6:04 a.m., an email arrived from her. "Call me as soon as you're awake. This is important." She picked up on the first ring. "Juliet," she said, her tone clipped but energized. "I went through everything. You need to hear this." I sat on the edge of my couch, laptop open, heart thudding. "Tell me." "They've been using your work in violation of your original agreement for 30 months, she said. "That's not small. That's not accidental. That's commercial misuse, and it's significant." I pressed my fingers to my forehead. "Can they argue it was transferred when I became an employee?" "They can argue anything," she said. "But no, not credibly. You never signed a transfer. You never revoked your old terms. And your documentation is immaculate. The pre-existing frameworks you used, the ones you wrote before joining, they alone give you massive standing. They never acquired your IP. They just assumed they had." The words hit like cold water. "So what does that mean for them?" "It means," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "their entire processing infrastructure operates on systems they do not legally own, and every month they processed payments on those systems counts as a separate instance of infringement." I let that sink in. 30 months. 30 months of transactions, 30 months of revenue, 30 months of systems they didn't pay for. "Dana," I whispered, "if I pull my license—" "You don't even need to threaten that," she cut in. "Once their general counsel sees what I'm sending, they'll understand the risk. No company wants to explain in court why they never checked the licensing terms of the backbone of their business." My coffee had gone cold again. I didn't drink it. I just stared at the table as everything slowly shifted into alignment. Mason had fired me thinking I was replaceable, thinking the systems I built belonged to him by default. He never once asked how the company functioned before he arrived. He never asked where the architecture came from. He never cared to. "So what do you want to do?" Dana asked. Her voice softened. "You have options, real ones." I breathed out slowly. I wanted fairness. I wanted my bonuses. I wanted the licensing fees I was owed. I wanted recognition of what was actually mine, not revenge, not destruction, just truth. "Draft a letter," I said. "Send it to their general counsel. Make it clear. Make it formal." "I will," she said. "And Juliet, this isn't a small case. You have the kind of leverage people dream of having. Don't underestimate that." But she didn't need to warn me. I already knew. For the first time since Mason's dismissive little speech, I could feel the power shifting. Not explosively, not dramatically, but quietly and undeniably toward me. Dana sent the letter at 3:11 p.m. on a Thursday, addressed directly to Caldwell Financial Systems General Counsel. It was calm, factual, and devastating in the way only truth can be. She laid out the dates, the licensing terms, the missed payments, the pre-existing frameworks, and the 30-month violation so plainly that even someone trying not to understand would still feel their stomach drop. Once it was sent, there was nothing for me to do except wait. I tried to distract myself, folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, reorganized my bookshelves, but the silence in my apartment stretched like a tight wire. I kept checking my phone even though I told myself not to. By evening, I finally forced myself to put my phone in the bedroom and make dinner. I just sat down to eat when it buzzed on the counter. A text from Leo Barnes. "What did you do?" "Legal department is going crazy." My fork hovered above my plate, appetite gone instantly. I typed back carefully. "Just taking care of unfinished business. Nothing dramatic." His reply came fast. "They say otherwise." I waited. Then he added, "Mason looks like someone set his office on fire." I could almost picture it. His stiff posture, the crease forming between his eyebrows, the way he always got louder when he didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't respond, but I reread Leo's messages twice, not out of satisfaction, but because it confirmed something important. The letter had reached the right desk. The next morning passed without any official contact, only whispers through colleagues. Caldwell's general counsel had called an emergency meeting. Mason had been overheard saying the letter was nonsense and blatant extortion. I didn't bother reacting. People who feel cornered always shout the loudest. By the second day, I started wondering if they planned to ignore the entire thing, which would be reckless but not impossible when someone like Mason was steering the ship. Then at 11:07 a.m., my phone lit up with an unknown number. I let it ring. At 11:09, it rang again. At 11:14, a voicemail. I played it on speaker while I washed dishes. "Hey, Juliet." Mason's voice chimed, overly casual, strained underneath. Uh, got some kind of letter from a lawyer? I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Call me back so we can clear this up. No need to blow things out of proportion. Blow things out of proportion. The phrase slid across my nerves like sandpaper. I texted him exactly 7 words. "Please direct all communication to my attorney." It was clean, professional, distant. He didn't reply. Monday morning, things escalated. Dana called at 9:32 a.m., her tone clipped. They responded, and they're denying everything. I sat up straighter. Denying what? The licensing terms, the missed payments, your ownership. They're claiming it's all work for hire and that your original contract is void. I felt my chest tighten. Not fear, not panic, but anger at their deliberate arrogance. Can they make that stick? They can try, she said. They can try long enough to make you bleed money. That's the point. She paused. And Juliet, they filed a preliminary complaint. They're going on the offensive. My breath caught. A lawsuit. They were actually doing it. Of course Mason is, I muttered. He thinks aggression makes him competent. That night, I sat on my balcony, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the city lights while the weight of the situation pressed against me. I wasn't afraid of being wrong. I wasn't. I was afraid of being outspent. Mason had corporate coffers and a legal team that billed $3,000 per hour. I had savings that looked smaller by the day. I didn't sleep much. Around 7:18 the next morning, my phone rang again. Another unknown number. This time, I answered. "Juliet, this is Elaine Ward, CFO of Caldwell." Her voice was calm, clipped, the tone of someone who handled disasters regularly. "I'm calling off the record." I said nothing. Let her speak. "I've read your documents," she continued. "I've read your contract. I've reviewed the payment logs. You're right." A beat of silence. "And Mason made a mistake. Firing you without reviewing the foundational agreements was irresponsible." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because hearing someone inside the company acknowledge the truth felt surreal. "What do you want, Elaine?" She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. "To make this go away before it becomes catastrophic for everyone involved." "Meaning?" "We can offer you $50,000 in exchange for an NDA and full rights transferred to us." It was so absurd I almost choked. $50,000 was less than a third of my bonuses alone, never mind the licensing fees or the 30 months of misuse. "No," I said quietly. "Think about it," she urged. "Mason is pushing the board to authorize up to $500,000 for litigation. He is determined to bury you even if he's wrong. You can't win a burn rate war with him." The call ended, but her warning didn't fade. She wasn't threatening me. She was telling me the truth. Mason would rather torch the company's budget than admit he'd made a mistake. I stared out the window at the city, heart pounding. This was the moment most people fold, take the money, convince. Themselves, it's practical. But humiliation has a memory. And mine was still fresh. I wasn't folding, not for Mason, not for anyone. The lawsuit arrived the following Tuesday. A thick envelope dropped at my door like a threat someone didn't have the courage to deliver in person. I held it for a moment before opening it, my stomach tightening as though my body already understood what my mind hadn't processed yet. Dana confirmed everything on the phone. Caldwell Financial Systems had filed a declaratory judgment action, claiming that all my work belonged to them, that I had no remaining rights, and that my original consulting agreement was invalid. It was aggressive, petty, and predictable, the kind of legal swing taken by people who believed sheer force could rewrite reality. I wasn't surprised, but I was angry. Angry that Mason was willing to drag the entire company into a legal war just to avoid admitting he'd been careless. Angry that the same man who hadn't read a single contract he fired me over now presumed he could interpret the law better than the people he paid to explain it. Dana walked me through the next steps. "We'll file a motion to dismiss," she said calmly. and I'm preparing a counterclaim for breach of contract and misuse of licensed work. But Juliet, you need to be prepared. This is going to be expensive. How expensive? 50 to 70,000 if they drag it out. My hands went cold. My savings were already shrinking, the comfortable cushion I'd built over years of nonstop work thinning with each bill, each filing fee, each hour of Dana's time. I wasn't irresponsible. I had planned for emergencies, but no emergency fund expects to stand up to a corporation determined to bleed someone out of principle. I spent the next week living with that pressure. Every morning began with legal emails. Every afternoon brought another request from Dana for documentation we needed to strengthen our position. Every night I took on freelance work, late, tedious financial system debugging for small companies to keep money flowing in. I slept in fragments, an hour here, 2 hours there, my mind constantly darting between fear and determination. And while I fought to stay afloat, Mason escalated his campaign from legal aggression to narrative manipulation. Leo called one night, his voice low as if he didn't want the walls to overhear him. "They're saying you planned this," he whispered, "that you set the company up, that you built systems you could yank back whenever you wanted." I closed my eyes, inhaled slowly. "And people believe that?" "Some," he admitted. "The ones who don't understand contracts. But the dev team? We know better. Ramirez spent 12 hours trying to dissect your reconciliation logic and came out looking like he'd seen a ghost. We've been saying for years management had no clue how much of the system was built on your frameworks." I didn't want admiration. I wanted the truth to cut through the noise. But inside the company, Mason was controlling the story, painting himself as the victim of a disgruntled employee trying to extort money. It was infuriating, watching him twist the reality he'd never bothered to learn. The next blow came on a Friday afternoon. Dana forwarded me a memo leaked from Caldwell's internal Slack channel. It was written by Mason himself. "We believe Juliet retained unauthorized control over several legacy components. The legal team is confident she has no standing. Continue operations as usual. Do not engage with her." I read it twice, 3 times, each line cutting sharper than the last. Unauthorized control. No standing. Do not engage. Mason wasn't just trying to beat me legally. He was trying to rewrite who I had been to that company, to erase the years I spent building the foundation he now took for granted. But pressure doesn't always work the way bullies hope. Sometimes it exposes the cracks they never meant anyone to see. Late that same night, at 11:47 p.m., my phone lit up again. This time it was a screenshot from Leo, an internal thread. Mason asking the dev team how quickly they could rebuild the risk mitigation engine from scratch. Ramirez responding with brutal honesty. That system was trained and refined for years. Rebuilding it would take 10 months minimum, maybe more, and our fraud indicators are already trending upward. We are exposed. There it was, the first real sign that the company was beginning to feel the consequences. Not because of anything I did, but because Mason had fired the one person who understood the very thing he was pretending to control. I stared at the message long after Leo's call ended, heart steady, fear loosening its grip. They weren't just fighting me now, they were fighting reality. And reality, inconveniently for them, was on my side. By the following week, it wasn't just internal chatter or leaked memos anymore. The cracks in Caldwell financial systems were beginning to show in places no smear campaign could cover. I didn't have access to their dashboards, but I didn't need to. Rumors traveled faster than data. A former colleague from compliance, someone who rarely reached out during even the biggest crises, texted me a single sentence late Monday night. "Are you seeing the delays? Because our merchants are." I stared at the message, feeling the weight of what it meant. Payment delays weren't just embarrassing, they were dangerous. A few minutes lag and merchants start asking questions. A few hours of inconsistent processing and contracts come under review. Fraud indicators rising without the stabilizing systems I had built? That could destroy them. 2 days later, another message came, this time from an old vendor representative I knew well. "Is everything okay over there?" When people outside the company start noticing, it means the problem isn't internal noise. It's spreading, and Mason, for all his false confidence, was too inexperienced to hide a failing infrastructure. But I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad, honestly. Sad that the company I'd poured so much into was being dragged down because someone wanted to protect his ego more than the business his father built. On Thursday morning at 9:12 a.m., Dana called, sounding almost breathless. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Richard Caldwell's office contacted me." I sat up straighter, heartbeat kicking. "Richard, he's out of the country." "Not anymore," she replied. "He's flying back early, and from the tone of the assistant, this isn't a casual check-in. He knows something is very, very wrong." For a moment, everything around me went quiet except for the faint hum of my refrigerator. Richard Caldwell wasn't the type of leader who ignored red flags. He wasn't perfect, but he understood the business in a way Mason never had the patience or humility to learn. If he was returning early from his London trip, it meant the situation was no longer deniable. Something had reached him. Maybe the delays, maybe the merchant complaints, maybe Elaine Ward's conscience finally cracking under the weight of Mason's choices. I didn't ask how he found out. I only asked one question. "What does he want?" "A meeting," Dana said, "with both of us, Monday afternoon." My breath tightened. "Did his assistant say why?" "Just one line," she answered. And I quote, "Mr. Caldwell has become aware of several concerning irregularities and intends to address them personally." Personally. The word landed like a stone in still water. Mason could manipulate internal channels, drown the truth in noise, bully his way through legal filings, but he couldn't hide from his father. Not forever. Over the next 3 days, I barely slept. Not out of fear this time, but because my mind kept trying to predict how the meeting would unfold. Richard was methodical, meticulous, and brutally honest when he needed to be. If he had reviewed anything, emails, logs, contracts, performance reports, then Monday's meeting wasn't about investigating. It was about consequences. On Sunday night, Denver was wrapped in a thin sheet of winter air, and I sat by my window watching snow collect on the streetlights. My nerves danced under my skin like static. This wasn't a simple negotiation anymore. It was a reckoning years in the making, between a father who built an empire and a son who tried to run it like a toy he didn't understand. And somehow, I had become the hinge between the two. When I finally lay down, I whispered to myself the truth I'd known since the day Mason fired me. He underestimated the wrong woman. Monday would make him understand just how big that mistake really was. When Monday finally arrived, I dressed with a composure I didn't entirely feel. The navy suit I chose wasn't for them. It was for me, a reminder that no matter what Mason had tried to turn me into, I was still the woman who built the backbone of their company. Donna met me in the lobby of Caldwell Financial Systems at 1:47 p.m., her expression steady but alert, as if she were preparing for a courtroom battle instead of a conference room conversation. We rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the air felt different. Not tense, not chaotic, but expectant, the way people sound when they're trying not to be caught listening. At 1:59, an assistant ushered us into the room with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Denver skyline. I'd only been inside this room once before, years ago when Richard Caldwell personally thanked me for saving the company during a near-catastrophic processing failure. Now the table felt colder, the chairs stiffer, the distance between everything wider than I remembered. Richard walked in at exactly 2:03. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, not just tired, but burdened by something heavy enough to carve itself into the lines of his face. When he shook my hand, he didn't fake a smile. "Juliet," he said simply. Then he nodded to Dana and took his seat. No small talk, no long preamble. He opened a folder filled with printed emails, contracts, and highlighted sections of my original agreement. "I spent 14 hours on a plane reviewing every document," he said, tapping the folder. "Your contract, your early emails, the licensing terms, the financial records, the payment logs we stopped honoring, the lawsuit my son filed." His voice tightened at the last part. "And I realized something on that plane. I realized I had failed. I blinked, unsure what to say. He continued before I could try. I asked Mason one question last night. Richard said, "Did you read Juliet's contract before you fired her?" His jaw flexed. He said he didn't need to, that he was restructuring for efficiency. Dana leaned forward, ready to speak, but Richard raised a hand. Then I asked him if he'd known about the licensing agreement, about the pre-existing frameworks, about the payments we owed, about the risk we took using her work without a valid license for 30 months. He closed the folder. Hard. And he told me it didn't matter, that it was probably unenforceable, that the legal team could handle it. The disgust in his voice was unmistakable. Finally, he looked directly at me. "Juliet, my son nearly toppled this company because he believed leadership meant ignoring the people who built the foundation he stood on." For a moment, the room felt painfully still. Then Richard slid 2 documents toward me. "This is the check for your bonuses," he said. 3 years, with interest. I lifted the paper. $117,000, already signed. "And this," he said, tapping the second document, "is the licensing agreement you and your attorney proposed. $100,000 annually, adjusted with revenue, 3-year renewable term. You retain full ownership." My breath hitched. It was everything we'd asked for, without negotiation. "Richard," I said quietly, "why are you doing this?" His eyes softened with something that looked like regret. "Because we were wrong, because you were right, and because a company cannot survive if it treats its architects as disposable." He stood. "And because Mason no longer works here, I fired him this morning." The air in my lungs felt lighter, sharper, almost unreal, not because I wanted him punished, but because the universe had finally balanced the scale he'd tried so hard to tilt. Richard extended his hand. "I'm sorry, Juliet. You deserved better." And as I shook it, I knew the truth. This wasn't revenge. This was accountability, delivered at last. The days after the meeting moved quietly, almost strangely so, like the world had shifted under my feet and was waiting to see if I noticed. The check cleared by the next morning. The licensing agreement, fully executed and countersigned, arrived in my inbox before noon, stamped with the legal department's approval and Richard's handwritten note at the bottom. "Thank you for your patience. We will do better." I stared at that line longer than I expected. It wasn't the money or even the vindication that struck me most. It was the acknowledgement that the work I'd poured so much of myself into wasn't invisible, wasn't forgotten, wasn't meaningless. It mattered, I mattered, but I didn't return to Caldwell Financial Systems. Richard extended the offer again formally. Vice President of Systems Architecture, double my old salary, full decision-making power. It was generous, sincere, and maybe a few years earlier I would have accepted without hesitation. But something had changed in me. Once you realize how easily people can erase you when it benefits them, you stop wanting to rebuild your life in the same place that tried to pretend it didn't need you. So I turned it down, politely, firmly. Instead, I started something new. For months, I'd been toying with the idea of opening a consulting firm, small, specialized, focused on system integrity and contract protection, the very subjects companies always underestimate until they're drowning in consequences. With the settlement money cushioning my accounts and the licensing revenue ensuring stability, I finally had room to breathe, to plan, to build something for myself, rather than for people who assumed my loyalty was guaranteed. My first client signed on within 3 weeks, a national retailer whose infrastructure had been outdated for years. They paid me more in those first 3 months than Caldwell Financial Systems had paid me in 3 years. Word spread fast. Companies were tired of the careless, the arrogant, the masons of the corporate world who believed titles were substitutes for competence. They wanted someone reliable, precise, proven. They wanted someone who understood the value of work and the cost of ignoring it. A few months later, Leo invited me to lunch. He told me about the company-wide meeting Richard held the week after I left. Apparently, Richard stood in front of the entire staff and said plainly that the company had suffered a leadership failure and that dismissing the people who built its backbone was a mistake Caldwell Financial Systems would never repeat. People told me it was the most honest meeting they'd ever seen inside a corporate building. As for Mason, I didn't hear much. Occasionally, someone would send me his updated LinkedIn profile, exploring new opportunities, the corporate euphemism for unemployed and not by choice. His last few posts were attempts to sound visionary, but everyone in Denver's tech circle already knew the truth. When your only qualification is inherited authority, the world becomes very small once that authority is taken away. 18 months later, Richard announced his retirement. Caldwell Financial Systems was acquired by a larger multinational firm, and part of the acquisition valuation listed proprietary licensed infrastructure as a major asset. My infrastructure. Richard sent me a bottle of champagne with a handwritten note tucked inside the packaging. Thank you for not destroying us when you could have. My son learned an expensive lesson. I hope it was worth it. I read that line twice, then set it on my shelf. Because he was right, it was worth it. Not for revenge, not for retribution, but for the restoration of something deeper. My work had value, my boundaries mattered, and the next time someone tried to wave away my worth with a careless hand, they would discover exactly what Mason did. Underestimating the wrong woman can cost far more than anyone expects. Looking back, what stays with me isn't the settlement or the signatures. It's the weight of the weeks when I had to choose whether to break or to stand still. I didn't realize, until all of this happened, that my quiet habits were the very things that saved me. The late-night notes I wrote to myself, the copies I kept just in case, the emails I tucked away even when people told me I was being too cautious. It wasn't loud strength. It wasn't the kind of power anyone celebrates. It was the slow, steady kind, the kind that sits quietly in the corner until the day you need it like oxygen. When Mason fired me, he thought I'd crumble because I didn't raise my voice. He thought being calm meant being weak. But the truth is simpler. Documentation is a form of self-respect. Preparation is a kind of armor. And patience, real disciplined patience, is sometimes the sharpest blade you have. If there's anything I'd tell a friend sitting across the table, holding the same kind of worry I held during those long nights, it's this: don't wait for someone to value your work. Protect it, record it, understand it. And trust that quiet strength doesn't make you invisible. It makes you unshakable. How to get started today. Save your own copies of everything you create, even the drafts. Write short notes with dates anytime you complete important work. Keep personal records outside of company systems. Slow down when people push you to rush. Pressure hides mistakes. Back yourself, even if you're the only one who does. What part of this felt most familiar to you? And where in your own story did quiet strength show up when you needed it?